All right. I say 7:04. I say we go ahead and get started and people can join us as they will. So good evening, everybody. I just want to initially start out by saying that this is a recorded webinar. We will be recording it to use in the future on our museum websites. So just to let everybody know. But for attendees, just so you know, your microphones and your cameras will remain off throughout the event. And I just want to welcome everybody to Revolution, How Black Gold Transformed the Military. My name is Melissa Mann, and I'm the site administrator at Drake Well Museum and Park, which is the birthplace of the modern petroleum industry. I'm going to be your moderator for this evening. Tonight's program is a really cool opportunity, I think, for us. It's a collaborative effort that's being brought to you by not only Drake Well Museum, but by the Erie Maritime Museum and the Pennsylvania Military Museum. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with us, our museums are 3 of the 21 historic sites that are owned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and administered by the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. Altogether, our 21 sites make up the Pennsylvania Trails of History, which is a group of special interest trails that lead to some of Pennsylvania's and the nation's most unique industrial, military, farming, and community history sites. We're very pleased to have you join us tonight as we explore the revolutionary impact that oil has had on the United States military. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank our partners, the Friends of Drake Well, Inc., the Flagship Niagara League, and the Friends of the Pennsylvania Military Museum for helping us to bring this program to you. So before we jump in, just want to go over a few logistics and also introduce you to the team who's going to be bringing you tonight's program. Attendees, as I mentioned, your cameras will remain off and your microphones have been muted for the duration of the program. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're going to hold questions for a Q&A period following the presentation, but feel free to send them as they come to you. That way we can go through them and get them ready for the Q&A at the end. And please also feel free to use the chat feature to make comments or to converse with your fellow attendees. Amanda Slider, who is the Associate Director of the Friends of Drake Well, is going to be monitoring the chat for us. She'll also be adding some very cool resource links for you later in the program. All right, so my fellow panelists this evening will be Drake Well Museum educator Sarah Goodman. Sarah's presentation is going to discuss how the demand for new petroleum products evolved in the late 19th and early 20th century. And also joining us this evening is Tyler Gum, the site administrator at the Pennsylvania Military Museum. Tyler's presentation is going to explore how petroleum transformed land operations and war-fighting concerns from World War I through contemporary conflicts. And then rounding out our crew here is our resident naval expert, Chuck Johnson, who's also the museum educator at the Erie Maritime Museum. Chuck's presentation will focus on the impact oil has had on naval operations from the Spanish-American War through World War II. So lots to get through. I'm going to kick off our program here this evening by taking a very brief look at the circumstances surrounding the birth of the oil industry. So Chuck, if we could, yep, thank you. And I'll just give you the high sign when I'm ready to move on to the next slide. All right, thank you. So on August 27th, 1859, the Drake Well, which was located along Oil Creek just outside Titusville, Pennsylvania, struck oil at 69.5 feet. And what that occurrence did was launch what has become today's global petroleum industry. Following, and you can see here in the image, that is the Drake Well, and the gentleman in the foreground on the right is Colonel Edwin Drake, who drilled the well for the Seneca Company, Seneca Oil Company. Following Drake's success, oil fever really gripped the region. And people, the people wanted wanted to take advantage of this opportunity for prosperity. And so they rushed up and down the Oil Creek Valley. They leased land, they drilled wells, and basically developed the industry. And for decades, Western Pennsylvania was the center of the world's oil industry, generating new technologies, new business practices, and new wealth. It was an extremely exciting time, in the Oil Creek Valley, especially, during those early years. However, if we zoom out a bit and look at the broader timeline of US history, we see that the birth of the oil industry coincides with the US Civil War, which was one of the most tumultuous periods in our nation's history. So if we could do the next slide, please, Chuck. In fact, John Brown's raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry occurred just 7 weeks after the Drake Well strike. And as you can see pictured here on the bottom right, we see the Harper's Bazaar depiction, or Harper's Bazaar's depiction of the Confederate attack on the federal garrison at Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Now, this action constituted the start of the Civil War, but it also coincided with the discovery of Pennsylvania's great flowing wells. Just 5 days after the shots on Fort Sumter, the Little and Merrick well, which was drilled at the lower end of Oil Creek near what is today Rouseville, struck oil producing 3,000 barrels a day. Now, pictured here on the upper left, this is well, these are two wells that were just a little ways north of the Little and Merrick well along Oil Creek. On the right, we have the Phillips well, which came in at 4,000 barrels a day in October of 1861, and the Woodford well on the left there, which came in at 1,500 barrels a day just the following July. So the flowing wells of 1861, 1862, 1863, they really transformed this very young industry. They were deeper than the pioneer wells that were drilled in 1859 and 1860, and they produced more oil than anyone had ever seen. So, as you can see, the oil industry has been intertwined with military action since its beginning. So let's take a look at how oil impacted the outcome of the Civil War. Slide, please. So, one way in which oil impacted the outcome of the Civil War was that it provided much needed revenue for the Union effort. And one way that it did that was through some taxes that Congress passed throughout the war on both refined petroleum products and on crude oil. So in July 1st, 1862, Congress levies a 10-cent tax, a 10-cent per gallon tax on refined petroleum products. So really at this time, kerosene. And in 1864, then they levy a tax on crude oil. In total, throughout the war, the Union collected $7 million via these taxes. They also, revenue also came in for the Union cause via sales of crude oil and refined petroleum, again, kerosene, abroad. Pictured here is the Elizabeth Watts, which was a cargo brig that transported, it was the first, I believe, cargo brig that transported crude oil and kerosene abroad at the beginning of the Civil War. Interestingly, for today, it departed on November 19th, 1861. So today is a bit of an anniversary for the Elizabeth Watts. But by the end of the war in 1865, the value of U.S. petroleum exports abroad was $16 million. And the development that the Union, that the Union made in these markets really allowed the North to purchase much needed war materials abroad, that things that they couldn't get at home, and really influenced the outcome of the war. And then finally, another way that the oil industry uh, helped to the Union cause was that it stimulated and strengthened the domestic economy of the North throughout the war. You know, as these wells are coming in and as more demand from abroad is happening, and you know the need for more and more oil, you know, it starts to stimulate what we would call the service industries, right? To the main oil industry. You know, you need wooden barrels to store oil. So the hoop iron to make those barrels stimulates mills. The coopering shops have to make those barrels. Um, Drilling and pumping in Pennsylvania, you know, is happening all over. So you're employing machinists to make the engines and the boilers to allow that drilling to happen. Oil is worthless unless it's transported to market. So new railroad construction is happening at this time in order to get oil to refineries and to market quicker. And that's stimulating the economy in the North. So all of these things kind of work together, allowing this really kind of, you know, newborn industry and growing industry to have a really big impact on the outcome and the Union victory in the Civil War. Slide, please, Chuck. Now, likewise, the Civil War played an important role in shaping the growth of the oil industry as well. Now, as you can imagine, for an industry that's born in the middle of, of a war, or at least at the beginning of a war, there are some challenges. You know, at its outset, the conflict caused a financial panic, which, along with overproduction of oil, caused the price of crude to bottom out. You know, in 1861. So the industry kind of had to rebuild that market, right? So initially, that was a challenge. Industry growth was also hindered by the action of the war. Workers, you know, that were needed in the oil fields had to become soldiers. So you know, there was a tax on, you know, on that work, on those laborers, and finding people to work in the industry. But the outside PA, so the oil fields that were outside PA, there was one in what is now West Virginia, also became a military target. Burning Springs, like I said, which was into what is today West Virginia, was actually destroyed by the Confederate Army, becoming the first big industrial site that was destroyed during the war, as well as the first oil installation that was ever destroyed in warfare. So that kind of hindered, because Burning Springs was, you know, it was developing right on the heels of Pennsylvania's Oil Creek Valley, and it was becoming a very big and a very influential oil field. But unfortunately, the fact that it became a target during the war actually retarded the growth of the industry. So those were the challenges that the Civil War had on the industry. But you know, there were some good things that, you know, actually a lot of good things that helped the industry grow, that and shape the industry in the post-war period. The oil industry really offered a hopeful future after what was a really long nightmare of a 4 or 5 year nightmare, which was the Civil War. You know, at the end of the war, the oil industry was booming. You can see here in this photo that we have the Grant Well, the office of Pit Hole's Grant Well. Pit Hole was a boom town, and it was, Pit Hole was a boom town that was just outside the Oil Creek Valley. So the area of drilling is starting to expand and new finds are happening. And so it is invigorated, in 1865, in early 1865, the industry in Pennsylvania is invigorated again. And you've got, wells like the Grant Well here, which was named after General Grant, that are adding to that excitement. And people were hoping to catch some of that excitement and some of that hope. Um, the war left the country flooded with inflated currency. And these hopeful capitalists were very eager to invest. And they were very eager to try to make more money. And so they started dumping their money into the oil industry and traveling to places like Pithole. The post-war also created an enormous workforce for the industry. After being discharged from the Army, thousands of former soldiers, both North and South, migrated to the Pennsylvania oil fields. Some made it rich there, some learned some things and moved on to other oil fields throughout Pennsylvania and then outside of Pennsylvania. Some didn't make it rich, some moved west and started chasing gold. But nonetheless, thousands of them migrated to Western Pennsylvania. But I think one of the best things that came out of the Civil War for the industry, for the oil industry, was new ideas and innovation, ideas that sprang from experience that men who fought in the Civil War brought with them into the industry. For example, Colonel E.A.L. Roberts was an artillery captain for the Union, and he developed the initial method for secondary recovery in Pennsylvania oil wells. Pennsylvania's oil well, or Pennsylvania crude oil, is very high in paraffin. It causes that wax builds up in the well and clogs it, right? So production goes down. What Colonel Roberts thought about it, and he thought back on his time in the military as an artillery specialist, and he came up with a plan for torpedoing these wells with nitroglycerin, and the engineering and the science behind how it worked all came out of his experience in the artillery. So those ideas and those innovations and the experience that these workers had in the Civil War, they brought it with them. They brought those ideas with them, and they also brought a drive with them. Right? They brought a mindset to the industry, and it was, they approached their work and they approached the industry like a battle. And you really see in this period that the industry kind of shifts into commercial warfare. There's a strike, everybody, the group gets together, they all move in. It's very, it's regimented, and they are organized in a way that they might not have been if they hadn't gone through this experience. So it's very interesting. As historians, we don't really play the what if game, but I imagine that even if the oil industry had begun during a less tumultuous time, it would have found itself linked to the military sooner or later. But as it came to pass, the unique timing of the industry's birth during the Civil War inextricably linked these two institutions. And with that, I am going to turn the microphone over to Sarah Goodman, and she's going to talk a little bit about the evolution of petroleum products.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what refining is and its impact that it had in the demand and how demand impacted refining. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a chemist, so I have a very simple explanation in things of how refining works. So Amanda will be sending you a couple of links that kind of go into greater detail of things as well, if you'd like. So Chuck, if you could give the next slide, please. So we have refining. Well, why we needed refining? At this time period, Colonel Drake drilled for oil because we needed oil in mass quantities to turn into kerosene for lighting. Crude oil was the main reason that Samuel Keir was able to figure out that, hey, he was using crude oil as a medicine, and he was experimenting with crude oil, and he quickly realized that this crude oil could be distilled or refined into a clean burning fuel called kerosene. Once that was discovered, it was realized that, okay, oil needed to be gathered in mass quantities so that we could meet the demand for kerosene. Keir's process was a very simple process. He worked with a one still distillation process. And the interesting thing about Keir is that he also worked with a gentleman called Benjamin Stillman, who analyzed the crude oil and discovered that if the crude oil was heated at even higher temperatures, that it could be refined into more products. But at that time, they weren't really concerned with those other products. That main focus was the kerosene. So if we could do the next slide. So what is refining? Refining is a separation of the hydrocarbons that are in crude oil through distillation, through heating. What ends up happening is, as the crude oil is heated at the various temperatures, the crude oil vaporizes, and then those vapors condense and turn into the liquids that are used. The easiest way to understand refining is to think about when you're cooking spaghetti. You put that large pot on your stove of water and you wait for that pot to heat. As that pot heats up, the water turns into steam, and that is the vapors that go up. If you take the lid and hold it above that pot while it is boiling, the vapors gather and collect in the lid, and they condensate in the lid, and they turn back into a liquid. And you can continually do this process, heating the water hotter and hotter and condensing more and more liquids up. And that is the very simple process of refining. The interesting thing about early refining is when you first start refining crude oil, one of the very first vapors that condenses is naphthas, which are the early forms of gasoline. And it's quite ironic because gasoline is so valuable to us today, but back in that time there was no use for it at that time. So they were really focusing on that kerosene. And it's interesting to note that at that early time, that some of that gasoline and stuff was just actually just poured out. It was waste. It was a waste product. It was not used. But they did quickly realize that it did have some applications. In the early days, that was used as a solvent and sold as a solvent in things. So can we have the next slide, please? So as I was saying, the simplest form of distillation is the separation of those hydrocarbons by heating them at the different temperatures. And that first vaporization is the naphtha, the forerunner of unfinished gasoline. And it was first used as a solvent. And then at higher boiling points, we get the kerosene next. And then after that, we get the products that are very widely used today. The jet fuels and other things that are turned into, and the materials and things that are turned into plastics. Can we have the next slide? So I like this photograph. This is an early print of one of the first refineries in northwestern Pennsylvania. And it's a very simple structure. It's just a several single distillation refinery, where the one in the 21st century photograph, this is many distillation towers, many capturings of all of those different vapors and condensing of the different vapors and things, and just a much more complicated process and more elaborate system. The interesting thing is the transition from the 19th century to the 21st century refineries. The demand is so quick that you quickly see, and I wish we had more time, I could show you all of the photos that I found of how quickly that simple brick refinery turned into the metal and these much larger refineries, bigger and bigger and bigger. If we could have the next slide. Something else to realize, it quickly became not just kerosene that everyone wanted. It was quickly realized that all of those other distillations that we could get from the crude oil could be used in many applications. What we see here, and actually the photos are reversed, but one of the first things that we have is used in the oil industry was steam engines. And then those steam engines quickly turn into the combustion engine. And of course, the combustion engine uses gasoline. So now we are wanting that naphtha that is coming out of the early refineries. We also, at this time, start to see, just after the Civil War and then the late 19th century, we start to see the automobile coming into the picture as well. But even before the automobile, there is something that starts replacing the need for kerosene, and that's electricity. Electricity takes over the role of kerosene. And when that comes into play, we see the refineries actually start focusing less on kerosene and starting to focus more on the gasoline products that we need for the automobile and the combustion engines. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then, of course, we get into the 1900s, and wow, this is where all of a sudden crude oil is in great demand. Refineries are popping up all over the place, more and more, because now we have all of these wonderful inventions that now need crude oil to run them. We have the railroad that comes in even stronger than it was during the Civil War. We have the first flight of the airplane. We have the Navy that's switching over to the use of oil. And now we have automobiles in mass quantities because of, excuse me, because of the Henry Ford and his assembly line. And then we also see the motorcycle coming into use, not only in the military, but also in the private sector as well. So all of these wonderful inventions are now putting a greater demand on the refineries in the 19th and now early 20th century. Can we have the next slide? So what are refineries really doing? Today, the modern refineries are amazing in that they take that 42-gallon barrel of oil that has been used and has been the standard in the oil industry since the beginning of the oil industry. And they are refining it, and they're turning about 20 gallons of it into motor gasoline, about 12 gallons into distillate fuel, such as the diesel and things, 4 gallons of that into jet fuel, and then the rest of the gallons are into everyday objects that you are using. They are chemicals, they are plastics and things like this that you don't even realize maybe that you are using in your everyday life. And it's an amazing process of breaking all of these down. Can we have the next slide, please? So an interesting thing that I was looking at in my research, and I wish I had gotten the whole quote, but the one quote was from a professor who was explaining refining, and he said, basically, one thing to remember is that refineries never sleep. They are constantly they are constantly running to meet the demand for crude oil. And the products that come from crude oil. And it's always interesting to remember that Samuel Keir and his simple distillation process that he was using, that he kind of started this wave of now the demand for kerosene. And if it wasn't for him and his studies and a few others, that the industry would be quite different. Excuse me, than it is today. It's also interesting to note that it's these new technologies and new inventions that are coming out are putting such a demand on the refineries. And it's not only in the private sector, in the everyday lives in our everyday homes, but it is in the military, of course, because they quickly adapt with the new technologies coming out. And so it's just everything and anyone putting demand. And I really like that idea of a refinery never sleeps. And I found another quote that was saying that refineries never stop cooking. And that's a great thing. So I have asked Amanda to put a couple of links into the chat to help you understand refining a little bit more. But just kind of remember that refining is that simple pot boiling on the stove and capturing of the vapors. And in the early days, it was just that one pot capturing that one vapor. But today, it's that one large pot, and now we're capturing all of the different vapors and capturing the condensation of those vapors and using every single drop of that oil to produce products. So with that, I am going to turn things over now to Tyler Gum, the site administrator at the Pennsylvania Military Museum.
Thanks, thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Like Sarah said, when you have a refinery that's never sleeping, it really does open up a lot of possibilities. And one of those things that really does start to open up the possibilities, but also change a lot of what we're talking about is, of course, vehicle use and fuel production. And that does really hit land warfare quite large. So as we start to look at some of these slides, the next one's going to actually show you photos of our World War I tank and a repair vehicle we have at the Pennsylvania Military Museum. The tank you see there on the left, it's a 1917 special tractor. It is not a Renault, but it is similar to a French Renault tractor. This particular one is actually an American production. It's one of 20 known 1917 tanks that are still in existence in the world. This particular one, though, if you look at the turret, you're going to notice that it's very different. It doesn't have the ball turret. It actually has a Marlin machine gun turret. So we're pretty proud that not only do we have one of 20 tanks in the world left, we also have the only tank of the 20 that has that Marlin machine gun turret. Whenever you think about the use of vehicles and their advent, of course, it's not just in your civilian world that they're going to be changing a lot of things. It's going to be changing a lot of things on the battlefield, such as this special tractor or the 1917 tank. When the idea of warfare starts to change and you have vehicles now entering the warfare, one of the most interesting parts that you start to see changing is tactics. Tactics and strategy are of course, intertwined. If you would imagine for yourselves, though, a three-part step. You have strategy, you have operations, and then you have tactics. And when you think of strategy, you really do have fuel production being at that strategy level, because now with fuel, you can, of course, have more vehicles on the battlefield, which impacts your operational level, which, of course, then eventually transcends into tactics. So in World War I, when we think about land warfare being a trench, or long Napoleonic tactics, the tanks that are now on the battlefield, the vehicles that are now out there, start to shift the question from oats to octane, as we like to say with some of our tours. So you're starting to shift away from the horse use and drawn carriages and drawn buggies to now having these huge behemoths. This particular tank you see here was actually a two-man crew. If the hatches were opened, you'd have one gentleman sitting in the belly of the tank, and then you have his captain or commander sitting behind him in the turret. It can have approximately 30 gallons of fuel on board. So you really do have to keep this thing fueled up because it's only going to be traveling at about 3.5 miles per hour under power of a 42 horsepower engine. It is not fast. It's 5.5 tons and 3.5 miles per hour. But at least if you're getting shot at, you got some protection. So when you think about, of course, the oil tanks and everything, and the fuel tanks have to be following the battlefield. Not only are you trying to feed the men, but you're also trying to now feed your machines. And originally, as Melissa said, when you think of the American Civil War, obviously you're not having tanks out across your battlefield. You're having horses and men. But now, of course, with the advent of machine and it now entering the battle space, you're having to plan for a lot more. And so that vehicle on your right there, beside the tank, is our 1918 repair truck. So the repair vehicles now have to, of course, come with you. So now you really are starting to straddle two sides of your battle space, your warfighting side and your logistics side, all because, of course, you have vehicles. Because, of course, we like to joke around and, of course, say that the Army marches on the stomach. But really now when you start to have vehicles and huge ones, as you'll see in a little bit with tanks and such, and then when Chuck starts to talk about naval warfare, you're no longer marching on your stomach. You're actually marching on your fuel tank because you continually have to refuel these vehicles. The great part about these two vehicles on the screen, though, is that it does change the way that war can be waged, and a lot of our men and women are going to be coming home because the casualty rates start to drop. However, there's going to be an inverse reaction to that you'll hear in a little bit. So as we move into World War II, what they realize is that these vehicles, while in World War I were great, they were not necessarily good for the tactics because the tanks were getting stuck, of course, in those trenches. So as we move away from trench warfare and you move more into sometimes urban warfare or guerrilla warfare, as we might have called it in the French Indian War and the Rev War time period, you now have huge open battle spaces, and tanks and vehicles are now being used more and more because you're not being stuck in trenches. You're now using your flanking maneuvers. You're now moving kind of asymmetrically across the battlefield. And you're using, of course, the idea of combined arms. So all because of fuel production and because of these huge, guzzling vehicles, you're able to do so much more so quickly across larger battle spaces that's why you now start to see, millions of men taking the beaches in Normandy. And what's right behind them? Not just the food trucks, but all the fuel trucks and the vehicles. In your top left corner, you have the Bantam Jeep, which is, of course, produced and made in Butler, Pennsylvania. When you think about trying to get around the battlefield, what's faster, a horse or a Jeep? Well, if you're talking in World War II, typically a Jeep. If you're talking maybe in Iraq, Afghanistan, and you're in the mountains, of course, it might be a horse or a mule or a donkey. However, in World War II in Europe, these vehicles are going to be getting men to and from the battlefield quicker, which allows for your casualty rates to drop because now you're getting to a field hospital quicker, and all because you have vehicles. To the picture to the right, Abigail, that's our Sherman tank out in the Hurtgen Forest. Abigail is a special kind of tank, actually, because she is actually produced in Pennsylvania. The turret was forged or the foundry was in Pittsburgh. Originally, it was a pink tank. It was pink because the artillerymen were playing a little bit of a camaraderie game against the infantry and the mechanized infantry. But Abigail is 40 tons. That's a huge amount of steel. It's a 5-crew vehicle, and you also have approximately a 400 horsepower engine in the back. And of course, everyone wants to know, what's your range on these things? Well, a Bantam Jeep, you're looking at maybe 10 to 15 gallons of fuel. It's 3 or 4 speed on the floor. So you're looking, depending on how fast the private drives or how rough he or she drives, you may be looking at 50 to 100 miles. However, when you get up into Abigail at 40 tons, so look at my notes, you're looking at approximately 150-mile range in open terrain. However, it's good to note at this moment, as we shift into larger battle tanks and main battle tanks, we don't actually discuss miles per gallon. We discuss gallons per mile, because everything you have to compute for is how long are you going to be able to drive this thing until you have to refuel it. And of course, that brings up your bottom left corner, your half track. Your half track is about 9 tons, so called because it has half a track behind it. It can carry approximately 13 people on a standard load, unless you want to really load it up. And it's got, of course, 2 weapons attached to the top. It's got a 60-gallon tank underneath it. So you're looking at approximately 200 miles, depending on what kind of terrain. The terrain is always going to impact the fuel mileage, and the fuel mileage is always going to impact how long you can continue to fight in that vehicle, because you have to refuel it. You're not just putting coffee and bullets and band-aids into this thing like a standard infantryman. You have to put fuel in this thing, or it's going to, of course, run out and kaput, and now you're on foot. So all of this is really starting to change how the wars are being waged, not just for the American battle space, but all other countries as well, as their tanks and their vehicles start to change. As we move into the Cold War, this is also going to be a continuance of that same combined arms. You're now having infantry, you're having airborne, you're having the artillerymen come into it. You're fighting, of course, from that post-World War II time period of Korea. And that really continues on, at least for military history in our minds, from Korea the whole way actually to the Gulf War. Technically, when you think about some of the different stretches of communism and the different warring factions from, I mean, even theoretically, you could take it back to like the French Indochina War, but that's a nerd moment for another time. In the photos here, these are our static displays at the Military Museum adjacent to a Sherman tank, Abigail. The oldest one in this photo would actually be in the top left. That's what's called a duster. These are now vehicles that, as we start to realize that you can put engines and different types of armaments on the battlefield, you're no longer just going tank to tank warfare. You can now go from surface to air warfare as well, all because you're able to, of course, run these things on all kinds of terrain. And most times this duster in Vietnam would have been used actually for extrication of downed troops, or sometimes for flanking maneuvers, but typically also in convoy protection as well. The other ones that we don't have, though, but are worth mentioning, are the gun trucks in convoys, because as you're starting to move all of this fuel, you're going to have to protect it, because in asymmetrical warfare, you're not just targeting your men, you're also targeting the ways and means of waging war, which of course is your supply chains. Your other photos here, as far as age goes, would be your 105 howitzer sitting out front of the museum. That's in the top right corner. It's 12,000 pounds. No, it doesn't have an engine, but you're going to have to tow this beast. So anything you tow, you're now going to have to keep fueled. And as we all know, coming out of the camping season, especially this year with COVID-19, how was your fuel mileage in your truck towing that camper? You're going to have to keep it fueled up, and you're not just getting coffee at the truck station, you're also filling up your truck. So when this thing is in tow mode and you're towing it across terrain, again, it's another logistical and operational consideration with fuel and fuel transportation. The last photos here are the M60A3 and the armored personnel carrier in the bottoms. The M60A3 in the bottom left is the main battle tank until it's replaced by the M1 Abrams. That thing is a behemoth. It's 54 tons, and it can carry 385 gallons of fuel. And I'm pointing out the gallons of fuel because as we get to the next slide, I'll tell you why, with these convoys that we'll discuss and then get into Navy warfare. This M60 can go 300 miles. So again, it's gallons per mile, not miles per gallon. So it's not going to go very far because of how heavy this thing is. 54 ton with 4 guys on it, and it's got a huge 105 cannon in the front. As we now move out of Cold War into more contemporary times, again, fuel is always an issue. You have all of these vehicles, all of these tanks. You have strategy being changed because you have flanking maneuvers taking place. You now have the ability to move into urban warfare, which is what we see in GWOT, or in a larger term, the Greater War on Terror. You're no longer in open battle space. You're now trying to traverse your desert into your urban, and from urban into mountain, and so forth. So what we start to see happening is the targeting of these vehicles. It had happened in of course, World War I and World War II, that as you have the vehicles change, you have the weaponry changes. So it's always the Newton's third law. There's always an equal and opposite reaction. And we've probably never seen that in greater terms other than modern time and Greater War on Terror. The left-hand photo there, that was an Iranian explosion on a fuel convoy. It was a NATO convoy in Iran. I forget the particular, I think it was 2016. They were delivering a bunch of fuel to some local villages and some other non-combatives, and it was targeted. This is the reality of current warfare. you're no longer, like I said, targeting just men. You're going after these convoys. As we think about then the vehicles that have to transport this stuff, you have to protect it as well. So when you think of what happens to these vehicles, well, they start to change. If you think back to that tank and that Bantam Jeep I told you about, you have that flat bottom hull. In the middle there, you have what's called a buffalo. And if you look at its hull, the protection of its bottom, kind of like a ship, is now V-shaped. So that as we actually start to protect our troops because of IEDs and that type of warfare, you have to have that blast go out around you, or else you're going to be suffering a lot of what's called TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, or at worst, it now actually downs that vehicle, like the photo on the right-hand side. I was Googling a bit of statistics. They did a casualty report actually on modern day convoys that I'll share with you. In fiscal year 2007 in Afghanistan, they were transporting approximately 88 million gallons of fuel, and that equates to approximately 2.1 million barrels. The average capacity of one of these convoys that you see photographed there. And Chuck, as we move on to the next slide, it'll probably make a little bit more sense. The Stryker convoy in the bottom, when we do convoy protection studies and we look at this stuff, what they found is that the average capacity of a 16 truck convoy is 98,000 gallons of fuel, or at least some type of accelerant that they'd be using, be it avgas or otherwise. And the number of full up fuel convoys required every year in Afghanistan in 2007 was 897. And what they were able to calculate is for every approximately 60,000 barrels of fuel in Afghanistan that year, you were looking at least one type of casualty, either killed in action, or you were looking at some type of other out of the fight casualty. And so they had to develop, of course, better vehicles to protect this stuff. So in the top left-hand corner is what's called a Warthog, and on the front of that is actually a mine roller, because what they wanted to do was protect these convoys in a better situation to get the fuel to the front, because you have to fuel all these vehicles and the air conditioners and all the cook tents. And by the way, you now have to, of course, keep your grid up, the electricity and internet communications. So you got to protect these resources and men. And on the right-hand side, the Symphony of Destruction. This is an M1 Abrams tank. It does have, I believe, 1 or 2 jet engines in the back, so it's running on a mixture of avgas, and it has a mine roller apparatus on the front. And so what you're going to be doing with that, of course, is trying to clear your convoy routes. And sometimes they even take on some dark humor, calling them Route Irish, which of course is a lucky route. And it is definitely not a lucky route because of all of these casualty rates. And before we move on, and I turn it over to Chuck, the last thing I'll share about a statistics for you is comparing it to Iraq, because it's the other side, of course, that we're still in more so now, is you're looking at approximately 502 million gallons actually in that theater of war. And you're looking at approximately 5,000 refuels going on, and your casualty rate jumps up to almost 2 casualties per run. And so you really are taking on some serious casualties just to transport this stuff, enough so that folks are looking at the fuel efficiency of the vehicles, trying to decrease their weight and also increase their protection measures for the troopers inside. A question that came in that I'm not able to answer off the top of my head is, what's the gallons per mile for a Stryker? Not enough is a short answer from what I've heard from our troopers downrange. But I would imagine it's probably close to that, similar to the M60 of looking at a 400, maybe a 300 to 400 mile range, or maybe less, because the fuel tank capacity might be less. So as we think about land warfare, remember that you're not only talking about oats, you're now also talking about octane, and the military really isn't marching on its stomach anymore. It's marching on the gas tank, because you have to, of course, keep everything fueled and keep it moving. So with that, I'll go from land warfare and I'll take it over to Chuck, and he can handle the naval side.
Awesome. Okay. How's everybody doing tonight? Thank you, Tyler, for the warm introduction. This is obviously a really cool collaboration that we're able to do, and I appreciate y'all for joining us tonight. So yeah, we're going to talk naval warfare, and well, really Navy history and then how oil impacts that. Found a really great quote right out of World War II that says, "The Allies swam to victory on a sea of oil." So This is obviously something that played a major role in the Second World War. But this story, at least with the U.S. Navy, is one which really begins with coal and the end of the Age of Sail era as steam power starts to come into play. Coal becomes a strategic resource for the U.S. Navy. Oil actually becomes part of the discussion in about 1866. Congress is going to appropriate about $5,000 to evaluate petroleum as a potential replacement for coal. Obviously, they did not. And they decided that at the convenience, health, comfort, and safety of the crews, petroleum just wasn't in the cards at the time. The only advantage really shown was there was not a very important reduction in bulk and weight of fuel being carried aboard naval vessels at this time. With coal, to maintain a forward operating presence, like other nations with larger fleets, the United States is going to going to begin construction on fueling stations that are going to be popped up throughout the world in different theaters of operations. One of the biggest things, at least one of the first true tests for the United States Navy when it comes to their steam age, the coal-fired age, is the Spanish-American War, because this is the first time. You got to remember, yeah, we have steamships in the American Civil War, but the Spanish-American War is the first time that the United States is actually going to be sent, the United States Navy, I should say, is going to be sent around the world away from our continental borders. Examples of naval operations comes in the form of the American victory at Manila Bay, which is 5,000 miles away from Hawaii. If there are not a readily available supply of coal or fuel, you're essentially dead in the water. So there's range limitations and resupply needs that make coaling stations absolutely critical. Another example of this is the Spanish fleet successfully runs the American blockade in Santiago. 4 American ships are actually absent at that time because they're resupplying recoaling 45 miles away. So despite victories at Manila Bay in the Philippines and Santiago, the Navy realizes that there needs to be a discussion of having readily available stores of fuel. Furthermore, coal's messy, obviously. Ships were designed around very large engines required to burn coal, and they're going to require a lot more space than the ships that come after, and oil-fired ships that come later on. Coal is also loading coal is also a major undertaking. This quote here on this PowerPoint, that's from a coal passer aboard the USS Connecticut in about 1907, and I'll read it to those who may not be able to see this. Our ship held about 2,000 tons of coal. All the deckhands would go down to the collier and fill these bags with about 500 pounds of coal. Then they'd hoist them over to us down into the bunkers, and we'd spread out the coal with shovels until all the bunkers were filled to the top. This is not a process that would last for just a couple of hours. Sometimes it would last 26, 27, 28 hours. And all the while, ships are without power. They're not able to move. They're stuck recoaling their vessels. Really good example, or really dismal example of this, is the Russian Baltic fleet during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. The Russian fleet were denied port entry to refill their coal supplies. And during this time, they actually overloaded their ships with about 1,000 tons of coal. And because of this, some experts actually point to this being the reason why they lose at the Battle of Tsushima in that very year. And we can go down into that rabbit hole, but we won't. The important thing is around the turn of the century, we start to look for different forms of fuel to power our vessels. As I said, coal's going to take up a lot more space on ships. Oil can be stored in multiple tanks, and they can be transferred and circumvent to wherever they have to go. The use of oil-fired boilers are going to change battleship design dramatically. That goes across all classes of vessels, and it's going to contribute to the development of larger ships. The last coal-fired ship is converted to oil on July 2nd, 1910. And by 1916, we're building our first, right out the gate, oil-powered vessels, which is the USS Nevada and USS Oklahoma. And with this, And how this changes the U.S. Navy, at least, is the development of a new type of vessel called oilers. And an oiler is essentially a ship that does what does what you think. It refuels vessels. During the Second World War, the U.S. Navy's fleets are greatly expanded. They need massive quantities of black oil, diesel fuel, avgas, and other fuels and lubricants to support land operations, sea operations in remote places around the world, especially in the Pacific. These supply demands resulted in U.S. Navy personnel refining many established practices for oilers and creating new procedures and replenishing warships while underway. So replenishment at sea, something that stretches back a little bit before World War II. In fact, if y'all know World War II history, you might recognize this name. In 1916, Chester Nimitz, who at the time was chief engineer for the U.S. Navy's oiler, the USS Maumee, designed and jerry-rigged a beam refueling system with ship booms supporting with rubber hoses and all that. And you can actually see it on this slide here. They test this concept eventually further on down the road. In 1939, the aircraft carrier Saratoga is going to refuel with the oiler Kanawha, I think is how you pronounced it. And they're testing broadside refueling of an aircraft carrier while underway, which is a massive undertaking. And up to this point, they hadn't done something like this. All in all, previous attempts took some accounts take over 10 hours. This attempt here with new methods and new methodologies only lasted a couple of hours. From 10:43 a.m. when the first line shot over to the Saratoga. Fuel starts pumping at 11, and they finish off and cast off at about 1:48. So this method of broadside refueling of aircraft carriers, just a specific example, is successful, and this is a method that they're going to take with them. The U.S. Navy is going to take with them into World War II. Sorry about that. Replenishment at sea, how is it done? There's a couple of ways. The most preferred is what's known as alongside connected replenishment, and that basically is when two ships or even a second ship, refueling ship, pulls up alongside the refueler. They're basically gonna cruise right next to each other. They're gonna hold steady course and speed. Generally, examples say about 12 to 16 knots, relatively slow, but you have to make sure that you're on point and moving straight ahead or wherever that refueler is going, because just a couple of missteps could actually lead them to collide, and you don't want that, obviously. Most ships can receive replenishment on either side except for aircraft carriers. That's because of the actual structure, the superstructure itself, the island as they're called. And then there's a stern fueling, apologies, which is actually the earliest type of replenishment. It's rarely used today, but it's just when a ship that is refueling comes up behind the refueler itself, and they attach that way. So how did oil change the Navy? One of the biggest things, obviously, is engines decrease in size. They're able to build larger vessels. We're going to compare and contrast two ships, one that was coal-fired, one that was oil-fired. Both of them the same name, USS Massachusetts, BB-2, and BB-59, not BB-8. I don't actually know what he's powered by, but Battleship Massachusetts, BB-2, they say is the worst battleship ever built. That's neither here nor there for this argument here, but you could see a steady increase in power and size of these vessels. BB-2 has a displacement of about 10,000 tons. BB-59, 44,519 long tons, fully loaded. A lot longer, almost double. Beam, which is the width, 108 feet, and then the draft of 35 feet compared to 27. But also the speed, 16.2 knots for BB-2, and all the way to 27 knots for BB-59 for Battleship Massachusetts, which fought during World War II. Different types of fuel. What we used to describe, for those who don't know, I was the director of education at Battleship Cove, Battleship Massachusetts, in my prior days before coming to the Maritime Museum. What we used to tell people is battleships like Massachusetts would fire a very, it's like a molasses type substance. And essentially it was just a bunker oil. Most battleships burned a heavy black oil, depending on grade, had to be preheated to about 180 to 220 degrees Fahrenheit. There are heavy black oil bunkers, look like a hot roofing tar. They had to be heated to about 100 degrees to push in through the engines. During the Second World War, really cool statistic, the U.S. Navy operated about roughly 680,000 barrels of fuel a day. In conclusion, really great example. I'm going to highlight the oiler Guadalupe. There's a book called Beans, Bullets, and Black Oil. Really, really great story on logistics during World War II for the U.S. Navy. And it talks about the Guadalupe in the Marianas campaign, refueling the USS Alabama on the 27th, I think it was May, 6,450 barrels of fuel and 4,091 gallons of aviation gasoline. Later that day, she's refueling 7,700 barrels of fuel with another 2,500 gallons of aviation gasoline. And I mean, she's just refueling throughout. It's important to note, and I think Tyler mentioned it, the Navy also operates on, obviously you've heard Army operates on their stomach, but the Navy does the same thing. And also obviously in the logistics side of the house, oilers are not just delivering fuel, they're delivering personnel, mail, movies, parts, ammunition, food, and other items too. So oilers obviously are a new thing coming out of the oil industry, and it's I think that's pretty much all I got. So I'm going to open the floor to questions now. Thank you so much for listening, by the way.
All right, so we don't have any questions in the Q&A, but if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll get an answer for you. We do have one question in the chat. I think this is for Chuck. Was the 680,000 barrels of oil a day during World War II?
That is correct. Yes, 680,000 barrels a day for World War II. A steep number. Best movie delivery. I've heard stories from some of the former crew of the battleship Massachusetts, but I don't know if I can say them here or their reasoning.
Let's see. Why was the standard size of a barrel 42 gallons? So that is so when the flowing wells came in 1861, the industry was completely unprepared, right, for that amount of oil coming out of the ground that quickly. And so they started using anything that they could find to put the oil into and in order to store it. But the standard, they started, really using whiskey kegs, right? Going out to the local pubs and bars and and collecting what they could that would hold oil. So they started using whiskey barrels, and normally those are 42 gallons. Yeah. And it was, initially, because those those barrels today, barrel of oil is a steel drum, but they were wooden barrels, and so they leaked. So it was 42 barrels, and that ensured that they got 40 barrels when it got to the refinery for leakage, because they're transporting first via horse and wagon over non-existent roads in Northwest PA. It's a rough ride. They're also I'm going to kindly call it shipping oil down Oil Creek, but it's more of a free-for-all. They cause a flood on Oil Creek, and people and these crazy people ride the wave in flatboat barges filled with oil barrels down Oil Creek with absolutely no control. So as you can tell, because of the way that they're transporting these barrels, there's bound to be lots of leakage. And so initially it was 42 gallons, and on a good day you definitely got 40 when you got to the end of the transporting.
Melissa, I see a question from Garrett. He says, how much oil did the U.S. consume during World War I, and how does this compare to World War II Army and Navy context? Garrett, if there's a really good website, I don't know what necessarily all sources they use, but it's defense.info. And they actually talk about what they kind of refer to as the oily beginning of some of the warfare of the 20th and 21st century. And it says one of the figures that I'd seen on this website was that in 1939, in Chuck's world of naval vessels in the world, 85% of the merchant ships were burning oil for propulsion. So if you think about going into World War II, that kind of gives you that figure of it. In World War I, the Russian fields had of course significantly declined, as well as some of the German production. So I don't know what those actual figures are. I have to pull them off the defense.info, but I'd also want to see what type of campaign figures might change to your question, because different parts of the war had different levels of logistical concerns and refuels. And so in World War I, America didn't enter until 4 years almost into the war. So we'd have to actually break that number down a little bit by country of origin, and also then campaign. So a total nerd moment that you probably are going to give me some fun for the weekend. But the other thing I would probably want to look at for it is where the vehicles were being used the most, like the Northern Horn of Africa, where it was mostly tank warfare with Rommel and the German campaign and the Americans. So I would say in World War II, you're going to see a significant increase, because as Chuck said, you have them not only used in your naval vessels, but now you have a humongous deluge, literally and figuratively, of new vehicles being developed for land warfare. So it's probably going to at least be double, if not more. But defense.info has some really good info on little niches of military history info.
There's a question for Chuck in the chat.
I was just going to jump in.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Brenda, oilers get refueled often by other oilers, but also, like you mentioned, it's a serious logistical puzzle. Make sure if you're close to land, you can refuel there, refuel in port. But if they're in a combat status, maybe sometimes they'll refuel via others. So, oh, sorry, I was just reading another question. I hope that answered your question.
I guess my question for Tyler and Chuck is, now, because of logistical issues with safeguarding petroleum products for fueling, is the military starting to shift to not only just in the design of equipment, but shifting to different types of fuel?
Chuck, do you want me to talk about some of the land warfare stuff, and then you can get into some of the nuke stuff?
I just quickly highlighted the Navy has an initiative 2020 where they were supposed to cut, I think, in half their oil usage, but that shift to nuclear power obviously played a major role. But I didn't want to jump over Tyler. Tyler, if you want to add something, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say on the land warfare side, they're trying to do a lot of initiatives with trying to drop weight on vehicles. So you're seeing a lot of different types of materials being used, because one of the big things about fuel efficiency, if you're going to have to continue to use black gold, is of course weight. And armor weighs a lot, and so does ammunition. So if you can try to change those things first, those are sometimes cheaper than switching over to some other of the fuel types, because of you're outfitting an entire, land warfare system, which of course is hard. And then you are looking at different types of fuel being used, and everything from your propane and your natural gas stuff. Most times the hardest thing is once you try to shift your fuels, is you guys still have to have fuel depots. So even if you shift the fuels, you still have to protect them. So if you're doing a lot of your fuel dumps at your forward operating bases, your FOBs, you might be able to use some of the solar and the natural gas and different types of diesel that's cheaper and easier and sometimes more fuel efficient. But then you start to get into all kinds of science and quartermaster depot stuff that I'd have to dig into. Chuck, can you speak to the submarine stuff with Nuke and some of the different technologies that they're playing with?
Yeah, so I think it was right around the time I joined the Navy, it's like 2010 or so, or 2009. The Navy had an initiative to cut back, as I mentioned, 50% of oil usage, fuel, and all that. 60s, obviously, the Navy starts construction of nuclear-powered vessels. What's great about a nuclear aircraft carrier is, and I don't remember off the top of my head just how long it would, that ship would be usable, or at least the nuclear power. I think it's like 30 years. Battleships and aircraft carriers during World War II had to be refueled pretty much once a week. And I wish I remembered the amount of money it cost to do that. But it was somewhere, at least in today's figures, around $7 million a week, I think, to refuel a ship like a battleship. So it's really expensive, but modern Navy obviously is going nuclear power, nuclear cruisers, aircraft carriers, and everything like that. So Navy's trying to cut back, but.
Okay, we've got Sue Bates asked a question. Did the Navy go with black oil because it was not explosive like gasoline?
Yeah. So the U.S. Navy initially, that was one of the biggest reasons why they chose to stick with coal, was because of dangers to personnel, ironically. But yeah, that'd be 100% correct. Like I said, we used to describe the oil going through the battleship Massachusetts as like a molasses, and it had to be heated to a certain extent to actually get it to push through the pipes. But and being in an engine room, a coal-fired engine room, was just dirty and hot and disgusting. Being in a oil-fired engine room was just as disgusting and hot, but not as messy. My grandfather used to describe coming out of the engine room of his destroyer as like covered in black, just dust and all that, and just covered in sweat. But
yep. We have a question about oil. Sarah, do you want to answer this one? How was petroleum sold as a medicine? Did you drink it? Oh, yep. I can unmute you just a second.
So, so oil used as a medicine wasn't a liquid form. It basically was just sold as pure bottled crude oil, and you would just pour it out on a tablespoon or a teaspoon and drink it down as an early medicine. One of our interpreters of the replica said that, oil keeps things running, and it keeps you running too.
It doesn't taste good. It's a Drake well rite of passage that you have to taste crude oil, and it doesn't taste good at all.
No, I don't recommend it. It leaves a very much aftertaste in your mouth for quite a while, and it really just coats. It's not a good thing. Please do not use crude oil as medicine.
We at Drake Well Museum do not recommend that you drink crude oil.
Yes.
That explains so many things, Sarah. That's all I'm gonna say.
Let's see. We've got a couple other questions. I think this one's for Chuck. In World War II, could smaller ships like destroyers refuel from larger ships like aircraft carriers, or did they always require an oiler to refuel?
Actually, yeah. So battleships would refuel, other ships in their task force. yeah, that was a common thing. So when a ship would take in all of their fuel consumption, what they would do is they'd have enough to parse out to other ships in their area as part of their task force. And I did see another question from the chat. Were refueling vessels very different looking than these ships they were refueling? Yes. Actually, I'll see if I can pull one up real quick. They were a lot different looking. Sorry, I should have prepared for this. They have a lot of hoses and here, let's see if I can get this. Am I still able to share screen?
Should.
Okay. Okay. This is what the oiler looked like. Is everybody able to see that?
Mhm.
That's a Chicopee class oiler. So you can see a lot of stuff hanging off of them. And you can see actually the main lines over here. So I wish I were able to enlarge that, but that's what they look like. So.
Very good. Let's see. What do you think the next fuel source for military vehicles will be? Coal, gas? What's next?
It's an interesting question, because when you start to actually think about what could you use, sometimes it's going to be what type of vehicle. And like Chuck said, the vulnerabilities of coal and oil and stuff on the Navy rigs is very much similar to land warfare, that right now there's not much you can do differently until some of the vehicles start to change, or the warfare itself starts to change. As we move more toward an autonomous vehicle warfare, that's where I think you're going to see a lot of technological differences start to take place. Because when you start when you don't need to move man or beans and bullets, like we always joke about, but Chuck has a really cool book title, which I was really excited about, because it says our favorite beans and bullets and band-aids. You no longer have to transport that stuff, and that stuff's really heavy. And that's the thing, is there's only so much fuel efficiency you can get out of current alternative energies for this heavy stuff, and that's kind of the issue. So if you're thinking about natural gas, like you see in some of our college campuses that have huge buses, that might be an option. And the other idea would be cleaner burning JP8 or types of diesel fuel and avgas, because you have a higher ignition rate and sometimes more power, more torque, or maybe redesigning engines for horsepower and torque and diminishing the weight of the vehicles might be a way. But I think if it continues the way it's going with autonomous vehicles, that might be the thing with solar and battery powered and even wind powered. A lot of your bases are already moving that direction now as well, because it decreases the amount of load on the grid. And it's also a decrease of terroristic attack considerations, because you're off the grid more or less, which is great. In many ways, it's great. You don't rely on outside sources, and you can't be attacked as easy.
Right. Well, I think that's all of our questions, but I just had a thought. We've been talking a lot about fueling, which is understandable because it's the product that is the most in demand. But it would be interesting to take a look at that shift from, say, tin cans for food to plastic, and the other different ways that petroleum-based products kind of infiltrate into the military, just as they infiltrate for convenience into the rest of society. It's interesting how our stories interweave in so many different ways.
How much bottled water is shipped currently into different parts of combat, or the MRE packaging, or chemical and mop gear. And you think about even some of the weaponry now is actually more of its plastics and polyethylenes. Yeah. It's very interesting. Yeah. That's a great question. That'd be a good follow-up talk.
Body armor, Kevlar's is a petroleum-based product, and
a Pennsylvania-made product too. Most times.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
I think we have a new topic for our next talk. the other uses besides fuel and transportation.
Yeah.
And we have to eat MREs on camera and test them.
Nothing wrong with that.
I don't know.
We don't seem to have any more questions. So I want to thank our audience again for joining us this evening. It was a lot of fun, and I know I learned a lot. And I want to thank Chuck and Tyler and Sarah for doing a lot of work, and for also weaving our very cool stories together. Again, we'll do it again sometime. And I hope that everybody who joined us will visit the websites of all of our museums. If you're interested in future programs, please follow us on Facebook or visit our websites. And we will see you soon. Please, everybody, have a safe and happy holiday next week.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Melissa, see you, everybody.
Bye-bye.